Today I'm back out here with the 2021 Acura TLX. Depending on how you want to look at this sedan, this is the Acura Compact Luxury Sedan, the Acura Midsize Luxury Sedan, and the Acura Flagship Luxury Sedan in the United States. Because the larger Acura RLX is no longer with us, the TLX has grown on the outside for 2021, but on the inside it has remained about the same size. So on the inside, we have the same kind of interior room that we find in a BMW 3 Series, packaged in a wrapper that's BMW 5 Series sized, but 3 Series priced, and there's no longer a larger sedan in Acura's lineup. It's just the TLX and the ILX as the entry-level option. The format of this video is going to be a little bit different than normal because it wasn't that long ago that I drove the TLX for a day. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on the advanced trim that I'm sitting right next to right now, pricing and comparisons at the end, how this differs between this and the A-Spec trim that I last drove, and of course all the questions that you guys posted the last time I drove the TLX. Up front, this wears the latest Acura design. We're also going to be seeing this in the upcoming Acura MDX, which is going to be closely related to the model that I drove today. We have full LED headlamps in all models with the accent strip that you can see right there. It's definitely very distinctive. In the last video, a lot of you were asking me to help make sense of the TLX's dimensions. On the outside, this is awfully close to a BMW 5 Series or an Audi A6 in terms of the vehicle length, front of the vehicle to the back of the vehicle. But on the inside, it is sized more like a BMW 3 Series. That's because of this very long hood proportion that you see right now. This hood is in fact a little bit longer, I think, than the BMW 3 Series hood. If you stand up front, just barely grab the end of the hood there. You can really see how long this hood is. And that's not because Acura decided to go with a rear-wheel drive platform and put a long inline-6 engine under the hood, which is the reason that we have a long hood in the BMW 3 Series. It is in fact primarily styling, because architecturally there's no reason that Acura couldn't have given us the same short hood proportion that we saw in the former generation TLX with the updated suspension and drivetrains that we see in this particular model. But then you wouldn't have this particular look, and the TLX definitely looks more like a rear-wheel drive vehicle. We saw the same trick to the eye in the latest Volvo models, the S60, S90, XC90, etc. They have this similar long hood proportion, longer dash to axle ratio, which is the distance between the front tire and the front door of the dashboard right there. Diving under the hood, you can see what's going on. We have the 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, which is the only engine currently available in the TLX. Very soon there's going to be a 3-liter single turbo V6. Apologies for getting that wrong in the first video. There seems to be a lot of confusion out there about the TLX Type S engine. It is going to be a 3-liter single turbo V6 engine. Now, Acura has provided expected power figures for that engine of around 355 horsepower. That's pretty much what we're going to see in the Type S. A lot of folks out there have said maybe it's going to be 400 horsepower, maybe it's going to be 450. No, generally speaking, when Acura says estimate, they mean that things aren't finalized on the specification page, but they're shooting for that particular number. So 355 is the target for the TLX Type S. You can see that this engine bay was designed for a 3-liter V6. Sitting this way in the engine compartment, so this is not a rear-wheel drive vehicle. There is an incredible amount of room between this engine and the firewall. The 2-liter 4-cylinder engine ends right about there in the engine bay. The engine bay goes all the way back there, actually beyond the start of the windshield. You'll notice that the entire engine is actually slightly in front of the front axle. So this 4-cylinder engine is not sitting on top of the front axle like you do find in a few vehicles out there. It's just in front, as we see in most front-wheel drive biased vehicles. The exhaust manifold is up front, and that's why the engine seems a little bit wider than a typical 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, rather than being behind the engine. That was done in order to help improve the quietness of the vehicle. If the turbocharger and the exhaust is sandwiched between the engine and the firewall, you get a little bit more engine noise in the cabin. By rearranging things and having it the opposite direction, it tends to be a little bit quieter. The relative space efficiency of the TLX is due to that long dash to axle ratio, as well as the overhang up front. Now, a decently sized front overhang isn't too unusual in this segment. The A4, A5, A6, A7, A8, they all have them in the Audi lineup, but for an entirely different reason. In the Audi lineup, they have a traditional rear-wheel drive transmission, but it has the front differential integrated into that case. That means that the entire engine has to be in front of the front axle. But Audi has done their best to squish everything as close to the front of the engine as humanly possible, and then of course the transmission itself is in a pretty typical rear-wheel drive tunnel that just sort of compresses everything back there and gives the A4 a similar space efficiency to the BMW 3 Series. At the moment, the Advanced package has the most comfortable and the most adjustable seats in the TLX lineup. We have a power multi-way driver's seat with 4-way adjustable lumbar support, power extending thigh cushion, and inflatable bolsters. A nice touch in this model that we don't see in all Asian luxury vehicles is that the passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat. So if you're looking for a vehicle where the passenger doesn't feel left behind by still having that four-way lumbar, extending thigh cushion, etc., the TLX Advance might be the way to go. We have a two-position memory over there on the driver's door, and we have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. The major interior change for the Advance package is real wood trim on the doors and on the dashboard. This is an open pore wood trim, and you can see the subtle accent lighting going right there across that metallic strip above it. Parts quality and attention to detail have definitely improved significantly in this generation versus the previous generation TLX. Right here in the middle of the console, you can see that we have the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control, the drive mode selector knob. I'm not the biggest fan of this enormous drive mode selector knob. It does seem a little bit oversized as far as its relative importance in the vehicle. And then we have the shifter down here. It's the typical push button shifter or hunt and peck shifter that we've seen out of Acura for a while. There's a button to engage and disengage the brake hold, the auto start stop system right there. And then we have the trackpad controller for the infotainment system. This is probably my least favorite infotainment input method at the moment. Even in Lexuses that have a trackpad, they're moving on to a touchscreen interface. And if we move on up here to the dashboard, you notice that even though we have this gorgeous large LCD, it's not a touchscreen. So you do have to use this trackpad to work with it. Acura believes that this input method is superior to the Lexus system because this is a relative position trackpad rather than imitating the way trackpads on laptops work, where you have to scroll. So if you're presented with a page of options and you want the one in the upper left, you tap in the upper left. If you want the option in the lower right, you tap in the lower right. If we take a look at the options on the screen, my finger is now in the upper left of that touchpad. Now it's in the lower right. You can see how that works. Unfortunately, if we're in Apple CarPlay, the system reverts to an operational method that's very similar to operating a Lexus touchpad system. You have to scroll to go through those options. That's frankly just a lot harder to interact with than a touchscreen LCD. On the driver's side, we have the same partial LCD instrument cluster as in the A-Spec. We don't get a full LCD in the TLX, although we are seeing a full LCD in the Acura MDX, so we don't know whether one might happen in the TLX very soon. The steering wheel is also essentially the same. It's a round 3-spoke design with paddle shifters on the back. And we find some additional controls to the left of the steering wheel. This is where we find the controls for the heads-up display. This is basically the same heads-up display that we find in the Acura RDX as well. The first thing to do is get the numbers out of the way up front. 0 to 60 happened in the same 5.7 seconds as the last time I drove the TLX. That particular model was the TLX A-Spec. And 60 to 0 happened in 124 feet, just 1 foot longer than that last model. Theoretically, this trim is the heaviest version of the TLX at the moment until the new Type S comes out, but the weight difference is not extreme, so it really does feel very similar out on the road. The biggest difference between this model and the A-Spec that I last drove is the fact that this one has an adaptive suspension system on it. The way this adaptive suspension works is that they soften the spring rate and then they have adjustable dampers to try and compensate for some of that, and you will notice the softer spring rate when it comes to handling. This has a little bit more body roll, a little bit more tip and dive than that other model. That said, the TLX is still an awful lot of fun to drive, so I'm still going to give this an A- when it comes to handling. Now keep in mind that the TLX is not going to grip the road as well as some of the European options because the TLX is notably heavier, several hundred pounds heavier than a lot of the rear-wheel drive competition. And even though this model has super handling all-wheel drive, it's not going to have a rear drive dynamic. However, you can get the rear end to push out a little bit. If you're in a corner and you floor it, you can definitely feel the super handling all-wheel drive system doing different things than we find in an all-wheel drive Volvo, for instance. The Volvo lineup, for instance, can never send more than 50% of engine power to the rear unless the front wheels are slipping. That's the one caveat for all of the front biased all-wheel drive systems out there. But this system can. There are situations where this system could send 70% of total engine output to a single rear wheel. Now, that's not maximum engine output. That's not all the time. That's under certain situations. It depends on exactly what's being commanded of the vehicle, the steering wheel position, the throttle position, etc. But even with those caveats, there's still going to be more power going to the rear than in the rest of the front-wheel drive competition, and that's definitely noticeable. It doesn't compensate entirely for the added weight or the added weight up front, but it does make the TLX an awful lot of fun to drive hard. Now, as I said before, the one trouble with driving the TLX at 9/10, which is honestly really easy to get to because this is so much fun to push, is that you can tell where 10/10 is located by being at 9/10, and that limit is just not as far as in something like a BMW 330i, especially if you were to get a 330i with the performance packages from BMW. The TLX also lacks the precision that we find in the Lexus IS. But that said, a lot of folks were asking me, would I buy this or would I buy the Lexus IS? I would definitely buy the TLX over the IS. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the pricing section. The Lexus IS is just a little bit on the boring side, to be perfectly honest. It lacks personality, and the TLX certainly has personality. The adaptive suspension available in the TLX has the biggest impact on ride quality. Right now, I'm in comfort mode, and the TLX certainly feels like a bigger vehicle than the last time I drove it in the A-Spec trim. You can firm things up if I move things over to the sport mode, but it doesn't become quite as firm as the last TLX that I drove. The adaptive suspension system has the biggest impact on ride quality in the TLX, and this score increases to an A versus the last model that I drove, which again was the A-Spec trim. The adaptive suspension has 3 different modes: comfort, normal, and sport. Comfort definitely has a soft, cushy feel to it. It feels a little bit like a Lexus ES, to be honest. If I put this in the sport mode, however, it does not turn back into a TLX A-Spec. It's always going to be just a little bit softer than that particular tune of the TLX. So if you're looking for something that feels a little bit more comfortable, a little bit perhaps more grown-up, then you might want to get the top end trim of the TLX with the adaptive suspension. But I also have to say, I wish every TLX had this particular suspension, even if that meant putting it in the TLX A-Spec and adjusting it for that particular model. It has a much softer spring rate, and that definitely means it's more comfortable out on broken pavement. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that if you're out on a rougher road with a higher speed limit and a lot of elevation changes, sort of those large whoop-de-doos in the road, then this suspension can feel like it bottoms out or near bottoms out if it's in comfort mode, because it is relatively soft. And you don't get that feeling in the A-Spec. You also don't get that feeling if you put this in the sport mode, where it can firm up the damping rate. Remember that with this kind of adaptive suspension, it's not able to change the spring rate. All it can do is adjust the damping. In my cabin noise test, a lot of folks were asking if the advanced package was actually quieter than the A-Spec. It turns out that it is half a decibel quieter in this model. 71.5 is what I got here. So I'm going to go ahead and bump the score up to an A. Fuel economy, however, remains essentially the same, and I'm actually going to lower the score down to a B for this particular model. Upon reflection, I think B+ was actually a little bit high for the previous model that I drove. Even if you were to achieve the EPA ratings in your TLX, I was just about half a mile per gallon off. This is still going to come in notably below a lot of the European competition. And if you want better fuel economy, there are a number of hybrids and plug-in hybrids that you could, I suppose, cross-shop with this, most notably the Volvo S60 T8. It's going to give you better 0 to 60 performance and better fuel economy. The thing to keep in mind with that T8, however, is that it's not going to be as much fun to drive as the TLX, because that model does not have a mechanical all-wheel drive system, so it can never send 50% of engine power to the rear. It's always going to have a very strong front power bias, and it's one of those unusual vehicles in the world that can give you torque steer and just a little bit of oversteer at the same time, depending on what you're doing with it. And speaking of torque steer, thanks to the super handling all-wheel drive system, that's one thing that we really don't see in the TLX. A lot of folks were asking, how does this compare with the Honda Accord? The big difference, of course, is going to be the all-wheel drive system. The second big difference is going to be the front suspension design. And that means that even if you get a front-wheel drive TLX, things are going to be more sorted. It's going to handle better, the contact patch with the road is going to be more consistent, and the suspension geometry up front is going to limit torque steer more than we would see in something like the Honda Accord. So even though 0 to 60 times are actually quite similar to the Honda Accord, we get the same engine, same transmission, this is going to be the more fun vehicle to drive. It's definitely going to have a more grown-up feel, a more premium feel out on the road. And if you get the model like I'm driving right here with the adaptive suspension system, it's also going to be more comfortable out on the road. The suspension tuning in the Accord lands somewhere between the A-Spec model of the TLX that I last drove and this advanced model in normal mode. It definitely is softer than the A-Spec, but it's not quite as soft as this particular model. Bottom line, if I were TLX shopping, I would definitely get the advanced package of TLX. I prefer the way this suspension is tuned with the adaptive suspension system over the regular steel spring suspension that we find in the A-Spec. I think that the normal mode and the comfort mode just fit the personality of the TLX a little bit better. The TLX is a relatively large car. It's not quite Lexus ES sized, but it's certainly bigger than the average compact luxury crossover and heavier as well. So I think that the slightly softer suspension tune just fits with the feeling of the vehicle out on the road. Some folks might disagree with that, and I do hope that it gets a little bit firmer for the Type S, but I also hope that the Type S is consistently a little bit softer than some of the European competition. I'm not entirely clear whether the Type S will be as fast as all of the European options, because it's likely going to be heavier than something like an Audi S4. So I hope that if that is the case, that Acura keeps things just a little bit softer, so we have a different option. Everybody out there seems to be chasing BMW so hard with hard suspension tunes, etc., that it's refreshing to find an option that's a little bit different, and that is definitely how I would describe this adaptive suspension system. It feels definitely different than a lot of the European options. A little bit softer, a little bit more comfortable, definitely easier to live with. And now to the nitty-gritty. How much will the TLX set you back? Well, it starts at $37,500, which is notably more expensive than it was last year. Of course, last year we got a base 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine, and this year we get a lot more performance, a lot more power, and that standard 10-speed automatic transmission as well. If you want super handling all-wheel drive, that's a pretty expensive option. It'll set you back $39,500. For those that are paying attention, you'll notice that that base price for super handling all-wheel drive in the TLX means that it is more expensive than an Audi A4 base with all-wheel drive. The base model TLX is the only one to get the narrower 235 with tires. The rest of the lineup has 255 with tires, as you see on the screen. If you want the advanced trim like I was driving this week, that'll set you back $46,300 for the front-wheel drive model, $48,300 with super handling all-wheel drive. There are a few additional dealer-installed add-ons that you can add on to it, but most of them are going to be pretty close to that $48,300 price tag, of course, before tax, title, license, and destination. Before I move on, let's talk about the trim. Again, the advanced trim gets real wood open pore trim, and if you get the non-advanced trims, then we get aluminum trim inside. But as I said before, not everything that looks like aluminum is aluminum. That's really standard in the automotive industry because there are a lot of shapes and a lot of components that really don't work well to be real metal inside a new vehicle. Now, where I got a little bit off track in the last TLX that I had is that the aluminum trim, at least in the A spec, is actually coated with plastic, and that's what threw me off a little bit there because we did remove one small trim panel piece from that TLX. I happen to own a materials engineering company. I stuck it in my X-ray spectroscopy device, and it said that it was actually plastic, but it was referring to the coating there. It wasn't actually able to penetrate down to the base material. So there is aluminum in there somewhere, but the coating on it is plasticized. Definitely keep that in mind. Now, does it matter? Personally, I really don't think so, because most luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, Audis, everybody's luxury car has plenty of imitation metal inside the cabin, and a lot of folks can't really tell the difference between the imitation metal products and the real metal products. Personally, I don't think it matters as long as it looks good, and it does look good in all versions of the TLX, but I think the wood definitely looks better in the advanced trim. With that out of the way, let's dive into the competition. First up, we obviously have the Lexus IS, because Lexus is clearly the most direct competitor to the Acura brand, and the IS is about the same size inside as the TLX. That's important to keep in mind, of course, because the TLX on the outside is about the same size as the outgoing Lexus GS, which has been discontinued. The IS is a bit more expensive. It starts at $39,000, and it also has a base turbocharged engine. Rather unfortunately, the Lexus Turbo is not terribly exciting. I know Lexus has a lot of commercials where they say the pulse quickening 2-liter turbo. Trust me, it is definitely not pulse quickening. It definitely is 2 liters and it definitely is turbocharged, but it's just not the swiftest thing in this segment. The IS also feels pretty old, if I'm honest, all the way around. Lexus recently gave it a little bit of a mid-cycle massage, but they didn't really change too much about the Lexus IS, and that really does have it feeling left behind in this group. My biggest complaint about the IS is that they didn't touch the engine lineup at all. So there are still models with an older 6-speed automatic transmission. That's the one that you'll get if you have all-wheel drive. We still have a naturally aspirated V6 engine. Some folks may like that, but it's certainly not going to be as swift as the turbocharged V6s or inline 6s that we find in the competition. And even though I don't expect the TLX Type S to be as fast as something like a BMW M340i, you can bet that it's going to be significantly faster than the IS350. That brings me along to the Lexus ES, because you could compare the TLX not just to the IS, but also the ES in the Lexus lineup. These two models are sort of the entry-level sedan in the Lexus lineup. The Lexus ES, however, is much bigger. It's the basically luxury version of the Toyota Avalon. So if you're looking for that traditional, softly sprung Lexus ride, that's what you're going to find in the Lexus ES. The IS is trying to be more of a BMW 3 Series competitor, but it looks like Lexus shoppers are really after the ES because it's always outsold the IS by a pretty wide margin. The ES is a really good deal. It definitely is more expensive than the TLX at $39,900 starting, but it comes well equipped. I think the interior is a little bit more cohesive in terms of design, although I have to say I don't like the design as much as the design in the TLX. I think the TLX has a more attractive interior, but the parts quality is more consistent in the Lexus. We also have an available huge LCD infotainment system, but not a touchscreen just yet, although Lexus might be bringing us one for 2021. At the moment, there are 3 different drivetrains to choose from in the ES. You can get the base model with either the 3.5-liter naturally aspirated V6 and front-wheel drive, or a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine and all-wheel drive. It's the same drivetrain that we find in the all-wheel drive Toyota Camry. Or you can also get your Lexus ES with a hybrid system under the hood. And that is by far going to be the most efficient entry in this segment. So if you're looking for a luxury vehicle that can very easily get you well over 30 miles per gallon out on the open road, the ES is definitely going to be an option. On the downside, the ES is not going to be nearly as exciting to drive as the TLX, whether we're talking about the front-wheel drive version or the all-wheel drive version, but especially the all-wheel drive version. Obviously, the ES all-wheel drive is going to be the slowest entry in this segment. It has just over 200 horsepower, not a whole lot. It's not turbocharged, but it does have all-wheel drive. However, if you're looking for something that's far more exciting, the TLX super handling all-wheel drive is certainly going to be a lot more fun to drive. Next up, we have the Volvo S60, which is the vehicle that I got the most questions about while driving the TLX. The S60 is going to be more expensive. It starts at $38,395. That's going to get you the front-wheel drive T5 model. That's going to be slower than the TLX because it produces less power. Now, if you want to get the T6, that's going to be more powerful, standard all-wheel drive, and more expensive. But it is going to give you better 0 to 60 times and better 60 to 0 stopping distances. When you take a look at the numbers, the S60 seems to perform better than the TLX. Now, I don't have access to a skid pad, but folks that do seem to put the S60 as having higher skid pad numbers than the TLX. It certainly stops shorter from 60 miles an hour to 0. We do that testing ourselves here in-house, and it definitely will accelerate faster from 0 to 60 miles an hour if we're talking about the T6 all-wheel drive. Now, the S60 does not have a torque vectoring rear axle like we find in the TLX, so it's never going to give you that yaw moment, that feeling like the rear end is pushing out a little bit. It's very controlled in the TLX, but you definitely get it, and it definitely has a bit more of a fun factor than we see in the S60 when you're pushing it hard. But in most daily driving, the S60 comes across as better polished than the TLX. I really noticed that with the adaptive suspension. If you get the adaptive suspension system in the S60, it definitely has a better feel to it than the adaptive suspension system in the TLX. One thing that a lot of folks noticed recently while driving the TLX is that if you've got 2 or 3 people in the vehicle and you're going over some large undulations in the road, there are times where the suspension can bottom out rather unexpectedly if it's in its most comfortable setting. I wasn't expecting that, and that's not something that we find in most of the competition. At least for now, the S60 gives you a little bit more LCD love. Hopefully, we will see Acura's new full LCD instrument cluster in the TLX at some point soon. You will see it, however, in the all-new MDX. But the S60 has a full LCD instrument cluster standard, and it also has that large touchscreen infotainment system in the dash. It's right around 9 inches or so. But in terms of screen real estate, it's pretty similar to the widescreen format system that we find in the Acura. The Volvo system is easier to use. It is not as snappy as the Acura system, but it is a little bit more intuitive because of the touchscreen interface. Volvo got a little bit of flack for their touchscreen system being slow in the last few generations, but they've really improved the processor speed, so it now is definitely better than it was before, but it's certainly not going to be as snappy as the Acura system. But again, a lot easier to use in my opinion. In general terms, the Acura is probably going to be more reliable than the Volvo, but the Volvo has a better interior. The parts quality on the interior is more consistent, and I like the styling inside the Volvo a little bit better. That consistency of interior parts quality is something that I've commented on in the TLX before, and right where the door, the A-pillar, the dashboard, the upper portion of the dash, and the instrument cluster all come together, it's an odd jumble of mix of textures and materials, etc., and it just has a slightly discordant feel that you don't find in the European options, whether we're talking about the Volvo, the Mercedes, the Audi, the BMW, etc. With the Swedish entry out of the way, let's talk about all the Germans together. We have the BMW 330i, the C300, and the A4. On the surface of things, the A4 looks like it's less expensive at $39,100 with standard all-wheel drive. However, remember that Audi gives you a much less powerful engine in that base version of A4 than we find in the TLX, or really most of the competition here. That's how they get to that low sticker price. If you want the 261 horsepower engine, then it's going to set you back $40,900, more expensive than the base TLX all-wheel drive. But the big thing to know about all of the German options is that as you start adding options, they're going to get consistently more expensive than the Acura. The big selling point for the BMW and the Mercedes obviously is going to be driving dynamics in the base model. The BMW 330i is a rear-wheel drive vehicle, the base version of the TLX is a front-wheel drive vehicle, and you will definitely notice that out on the road. Even if you get super handling all-wheel drive and you choose to get all-wheel drive on your BMW 330, the 330 is definitely going to have more of that rear-wheel drive dynamic. The front end is not going to start plowing in the corners quite as soon as the TLX, and the grip level is certainly better in the 330i. The TLX is relatively heavy, and some of those performance metrics, even though the TLX has a great feel out on the road, they definitely fall behind the German competition. So what's the bottom line? Is the TLX as dynamic as a rear-wheel drive BMW? No. Does it have the interior refinement of a Mercedes-Benz C-Class? No. Does it have the gadgets that we find in an Audi A4? Again, no. But it is going to be $5,000 to $7,000 less expensive comparably equipped, so it's unquestionably the value alternative here. What makes things a little bit more complicated is that the pricing structure has definitely moved closer to the European options than in the past. And it's not quite as simple as saying, well, I can get more for less in the Acura. Obviously, that's always been true, and it is certainly still true for 2021. Some of the trouble is that for $48,000 or $49,000, the price of a top-end Acura TLX 2.0 super handling all-wheel drive, you could definitely get some of that equipment in a BMW 330i that's rear-wheel drive, and I think have a slightly nicer experience at the same time. Again, obviously you're not going to get the same level of equipment in that particular model that you would find in the top-end trim of the TLX, but because the pricing structure of the TLX has moved up market, and now there's a little bit more overlap, it's not like a fully loaded TLX is going to cost you the same as a base BMW 3 Series or Mercedes-Benz C-Class. Now, when we're talking about the Mercedes, those numbers are definitely a little further apart because the options in the Mercedes are pretty expensive, but you can still get a reasonably equipped BMW 3 Series for about $48,000 or $49,000. What would be your pick? Let me know down there in the comment section below. Be sure and head over to AOAmerch.com so you can buy merch right like this shirt here. It's our exclusive Trunk Comfort Index. There are a number of additional designs coming between now and the end of the year, so be sure and stay tuned for those, including one featuring a poodle right on the front. You'll have to go over to AOAmerch.com to check that one out. I'll see all of you later. Be sure and check out Facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social things, and I'll see all of you next week.